I died for 9 minutes. On December 3rd, 2024, a 30-ton trailer and a 6-lane highway decided how my story would proceed, and I woke up with a truth burning in my chest that I could not keep to myself. The devil's most effective trap is not what you think. It isn't addiction or violence or some headline sin. It's a comfortable conviction that being good is the same thing as being saved. That's what Jesus showed me. My name is Robert Hayes. I'm a husband to Sarah, father to Emma and Jake, a project manager who coached Little League, who tacked baseball cards to the wall when I was a kid and knew how to change the oil in my truck. My life looked the way most people's lives look when they feel they're doing the right things. Steady job, faithful marriage, volunteer hours at the church soup kitchen, always paid my taxes, gave to the school fundraiser, said I'm sorry when I messed up. I thought my moral ledger would be enough the day I stood before whatever comes next. If what I'm about to say pricks something in you, type "good isn't enough" in the comments. I want to know I'm not the only one who needs to hear this. If that makes you uncomfortable, good. Stay with me. I grew up in a town with a single stoplight and a diner where the waitresses remembered everyone's coffee order. My mother sang the old hymns when she thought no one was listening, and my father coached baseball until the lights went out. We went to church on Christmas and Easter, and my parents taught us to be kind, to be responsible, to work with your hands and honor your word. Those were the virtues of our home. Nobody in my family ever talked about being born again like it was the only thing that mattered. We were people who believed in being decent. When Mom got sick, she did something that surprised me. She had always been a good person, never the loud Christian type, but during her last months, she started talking about prayer in a way I'd never heard her speak. She asked for the pastor to come sit with her. She prayed out loud for peace. She told me she had found something that made her stop being afraid. I stood at her bedside and saw a light in her eyes I had never seen before, an ease that wasn't merely the quiet of accepting illness. She died trusting in Jesus, and at her funeral, half the town came to say how kindly she'd treated them. I remember hoping that I could be like her, kind, responsible, useful. I remember thinking that kindness, along with a decent life, made me right with God. College hardened a quieter sin, self-reliance. I learned to solve problems, to manage budgets, to figure things out. Faith became a private thing, an occasional, "Lord, give me wisdom," whispered like a last resort tool, useful, but not indispensable. When Sarah and I married, we promised to make a good life. We both worked hard. We taught Emma and Jake to say please and thank you, and to look people in the eye. We took them to the community harvest festival.
We read bedtime stories. I never cheated on my taxes, and I never walked out on my family. I thought those were the signposts that mattered. There were moments when I should have leaned into God and didn't. When Mom was dying, I listened to her talk about faith and made polite remarks about peace, but I didn't ask her to tell me more. When my company downsized 5 years ago and I lost a job, I prayed for favor, but honestly, I spent more time polishing my resume than praying. I justified my distance with platitudes. God sees my heart, or I'm a good person, that has to count for something. I believed the Bible said we are saved by grace through faith, but in practice, I leaned on my goodness like a coat on a cold day. It's not that I was wicked. I wasn't. I coached Jake's team, practices on Tuesday, games on Saturdays. I fixed Mrs. Ellison's porch steps for a neighbor who couldn't afford a contractor. I volunteered at the high school fundraiser and showed up on Sundays when the sermon was about family values. People would say, "Robert, you're a pillar." It's flattering to hear. It's dangerous to hear and believe it without asking the next question. A pillar for whom? For what? The trap works because it's dressed in virtue. The devil knows that when someone looks in the mirror and sees a decent life, the need for radical surrender disappears. We swap scandalous sin for respectable living and call it good enough. We measure ourselves by our neighbors and by the checks we write, not by the state of our hearts before God. I remember the day before the accident as ordinary in the way that real life is ordinary. Laundry, emails, a sandwich for lunch. Sarah had left for the day to pick up Emma from piano, and I had promised to be home in time to help with homework. On the interstate, I was thinking about a deadline and a budget, about a window that needed to be replaced at the house. The sky was the clean blue that bled into winter. I was wearing a jacket with a grease stain on the sleeve from a Saturday I'd spent under the truck. My truck was my place of thought, the hum of the engine a metronome. Then, in a flash, it was metal and silence. They told me later, because I don't remember the impact itself, that a semi had jackknifed, that my truck was crushed between trailer and guardrail. The details felt clinical when the EMTs described them, and they were careful to keep their voices steady around Sarah when she arrived at the hospital. What I remember most is the sudden, total quiet after the world went wrong. People talk about the brain recording every detail as it dies. What I experienced was not a cinematic replay, but a dissolving of everything I had relied on. Smells, names, obligations, my identity as provider and fixer. Those things fell away like clothes when you step into a bath. Then there was light. That's the first thing I can say without stumbling over inadequate words. It wasn't a spot or a beam.
It was an all-encompassing gentleness that didn't glare but welcomed. It was not the whiteness of hospital fluorescent lights. It felt like warmth without heat, like the kind touch of someone who knew the exact shape of your sorrow. In that field of light there was a peace that held no questions about rightness or wrongness. It simply was. I had expected fear or emptiness, some hollow conclusion. Instead, I felt known. And then I saw him. You can suspect all you want about visions and their reliability, and I don't insist this must be doctrinal proof for anyone else. I only know what I saw. He didn't arrive like some cinematic messiah. He was present with a quiet gravity that made my chest lighter and my shame heavier at the same time. He looked like the images I'd half remembered from my childhood church, compassion in his face, but there was an authority there that didn't need to be loud. When he looked at me, whatever vanity I had about being a good man dropped, like a child taking off a hat that never fit. He spoke to me in a voice that was somehow both velvet and steel. He said, "Robert." That single word carried more intimacy than any confession I'd made. It was the kind of knowing that didn't tally my deeds, but saw my heart. What did I do? I wanted to ask, or maybe I wanted to tell him I had tried. Instead, I felt the truth of many small evasions I had rehearsed for myself, good deeds that became excuses, prayers that were half-hearted offers, a faith that lived in the margins. I felt exposed, not by condemnation, but by invitation to see. He did not list my sins. He showed me what was happening to people who were like me, people who lived clean lives, who loved their families, who were kind in public and measured in private. He showed me faces I recognized in different skins and stories, a businessman who donated to every charity but had never knelt to ask forgiveness, a schoolteacher who took a stand for fairness in the classroom but had quietly pushed God to the edge of his life, a nurse who stayed overnight caring for patients and yet assumed her kindness would bridge the gap with God. He said to me, "The most effective thing I watch the devil do is not to lead men into obvious sin. He convinces them their goodness is the same as my righteousness." Those words landed like stones. They created ripples in everything I thought I knew. I watched scenes unfold like a tapestry. A mother folding laundry, her face set with care, saying bedtime prayers that were more habit than heart. A construction worker whistling as he set beams, honest about his pay and proud of his craft. A man in a suit at the head of a charity board, writing a check and feeling the satisfaction of a clean conscience. In each vignette there was decency. There was also an absence, a missing hinge on the door that would open their hearts to surrender. Jesus leaned toward me in that place. I could feel the sadness in his eyes, a pastoral sorrow. He said, "They will stand before me confident in their ledger, certain their works will speak for them." I understood without being told that this was a warning. Goodness untethered from surrender is a dangerous substitute. I tried to protest, not with words, but with the life I had built. I have been faithful, I wanted to say. I have treated people well. I taught my children to be kind. Isn't that what counts? The answer I felt in that presence was tender and devastating. He did not belittle my kindness. He acknowledged it as fruit, real and valuable. But he said that fruit is not the root. Fruit grows from the life. If the root is not connected to him, the fruit can't save. You can dress humility in 1,000 ways. I was proud of my humility. The devil picks that kind of pride clean. The trap is not the shout sin that headlines scream about. It is the quiet contentment of a soul convinced that decency and duty are the same thing as repentance and trust. He showed me faces again, only now they were moving toward judgment with bewilderment.
I saw them standing before a presence that was not angry so much as exact, like a father who knows his children but refuses to be bypassed. They opened their mouths and their pleas sounded like explanations. But I loved my wife. I fed the poor. I didn't steal. I forgave when I could. In the vision, their arguments fell apart, not because God did not value what they had done, but because they had used their goodness as a currency to purchase a place they had not been offered. In that moment, I felt something like terror, less at punishment than at the idea of missing the only thing that could make a life whole. It wasn't a horror movie fear. It was the sober realization that I had been traveling the wrong road, and I had given myself reasons for the map I was following. He looked at me and said, quietly, "This is the devil's greatest trick, to make people believe their goodness will be enough." The words were simple, but they landed in me, and I felt them rearrange everything. Images of my hands that built things, that cooked dinners, that fixed the neighbor's gate, suddenly felt like hands that had never reached up to receive. The notion of being good had been a blanket under which I hid. Between the light and the sound of his voice, pages of my life flicked by, not as a condemnation, but as evidence. There was the time I murmured, "I'll get around to reading my Bible," and then didn't. There was the time I saw someone homeless on the corner and gave a few dollars without asking their name or listening to their story. There was the birthday I missed because I was working late and assumed my presence in every other way would make up for an absence. I wept in that place, not because I thought I deserved punishment, though the thought of judgment is sobering, but because I suddenly wanted something I had barely thought to want, for my life to be rooted in him, not in my own repair work.
He didn't leave me to the grief. He invited me to look closer. He said, with a voice that held both sorrow and hope, "The door is open." For the first time, I understood repentance not as a list of apologies, but as a turning, an about-face from reliance on my own righteousness to dependence on his. It felt like stepping off a cliff into something that would hold me, not because I had earned it, but because it was offered. Grace was not a vague theological idea anymore. It was the hand extended in the light. I asked, somehow, "Is there time?" The answer was formed less in words and more as presence. He let me see the thin line that divides our times, that it is shorter for some than others, and he made me know that the only sensible posture is one of readiness, not complacency. Complacency had been the thing I'd hidden behind all my good deeds, the quiet narcissism of thinking my efforts equaled God's gift. Then the vision shifted. I was shown crowds, rooms filled with people who wore goodness like armor, faces I recognized from church bulletins and PTA meetings, from the neighborhood and the office, from scouting nights in the clinic. I could see the teacher with the stained cardigan, the businessman with the tidy ledger, the nurse with flour on her jeans from a potluck casserole, the construction worker with calluses that matched his integrity. They were all there, lined up, and I watched them stumble when their inner argument, "I was good," or "I tried my best," was not an argument that stood before the one who judges the heart. At that sight, I felt a fierce urgency well up inside me. It wasn't condemnation. It was like someone seeing a train headed for a bridge with the support sanded out and trying to shout to those inside to get out. I wanted to run into those crowds and shake them, to say, "This isn't about your kindness alone. This is about where your heart rests, on your works or on him." I pleaded in that place, not for my own life alone, but for others. I asked, "What do I do? How do I tell them?" His answer was simple and direct. He said, "Go, tell them what you have seen. Tell them the door is open. Tell them their goodness is real and beautiful, but it must be rooted in me." When he told me to go, there wasn't the kind of fear you get in movies. Instead, there was the uneasiness of knowing you have been given urgent news, and you are suddenly responsible for carrying it. He didn't equip me with arguments or theological proofs. He gave me a mandate of love. Warn, invite, make space for repentance. That's where everything tilted for me. Up to that point, I had been content to be a quiet example, to let my life speak. Now I understood that a life could be exemplary and still miss the essential step of surrender. He asked me to speak plainly, without shame, without theatricality, just to share the reality I had seen and the posture I had been given. I wanted to ask him if it was fair.
If
After a lifetime of decent behavior, being told your goodness falls short wasn't cruel, but he looked at me with an affection that softened the sting. He said, "I do not despise your works. I long for your heart." The peace I had felt in the first moments was still there, but now it had a razor of urgency. He made me feel the weight of those who would stand and be confused. He made me feel my own slope toward that same confusion. The realization was too heavy to bear alone. Then something pulled me back. I don't remember the exact mechanics, one breath in the light and then a struggle, like being pulled through water. In my memory, the light narrowed to a pinhole, and sound, blunt, clinical, crept back. The beeping of monitors, the rustle of white coats, the low voices of people who had been waiting elsewhere. Pain returned in a way that made me grateful for the small comforts of the body. Sarah's hair falling across my face, the warmth of a blanket, the smell of antiseptic that was both alien and familiar. I woke in the ICU to the sight of Sarah's face, the way you only see a loved one's face when everything else is more fragile. Her eyes were red, her hand gripping mine like an anchor. I blinked, and there was the harsh fluorescent light, the monitors, and the slow, deliberate movements of nurses who did 1,000 tiny tasks so that life could keep looking like it would continue. I told her only fragments at first, how bright it had been, how he had said my name, how he had spoken about those who thought goodness would suffice. She listened with that sharp, steady attention that people give when the thin veil between this world and the next feels torn. Later, when the doctors walked in with their measured sentences, "You were clinically dead for 9 minutes. There was a pulmonary contusion. We operated to stabilize you." Their words were heavy, but not as heavy as what had been given to me. That night, the room was full of practical care and impossible questions. Sarah wept quietly. The kids had been kept away. Too raw, the nurses said. The pastor from our church, Pastor Johnson, came and put his hand on my shoulder. He didn't ask for details. He simply prayed, his voice steady. I listened, and I felt the push and pull of my old life with the new mandate lodged like a stone in my throat. In the days that followed, recovery was a sequence of small victories and tender humiliations. There were physical therapies and stitches, and the obvious gratitude that comes when you survive something that could have been the end. I had a chart of physical rehab goals, numbers and percentages, but under all that practical progress was the deeper ledger I carried now, the urgency to tell, the mandate not yet fully formed into words. People expected a tidy miracle story, rise from the gurney, shout hallelujah, go straight into the pulpit. Life never fits neatly into our expectations. My first public words about what happened trembled in my mouth.
I spoke to friends, to coworkers, to our small group, and each time I tried to tell them what I had seen, I felt the old defenses raise in others. "Robert, you were spared," some would say. "You must have been protected." Others smiled with a kind of polite curiosity and asked about the medical side. Few asked, "What did you see? What did you hear?" One night, Pastor Johnson and I sat on the back steps of the church long after the fellowship hall had emptied. He listened while the night gathered itself around the parking lot. When I finished, he was quiet for a long time. Finally, he asked, "Do you believe what you saw?" "Yes," I said. "I believe it changed me." He nodded slowly, the lines on his face deepening. "Then tell the truth plainly," he said. "People are hungry for the sort of honesty that doesn't wear an armor of good works and pretend it's the same as surrender. They think their life is a ledger. Show them a life that was rearranged." It felt enormous to be given the permission to be blunt. I thought about all the conversations I had avoided because they were uncomfortable. The ones with men at the job site who half smiled when I mentioned church, the PTA moms who traded recipes and life hacks but never asked about the soul, the neighbors who waved on Sundays while the vacuum hum of their television drowned out any spiritual talk at home. I remembered the businessman who had once told me, with a cautious pride, that he supported every charity within 20 miles. I thought of the nurse who came by the house one afternoon and sat on the porch swing, her hands smelling faintly of hospital soap while she told me about a patient she couldn't stop thinking about. I thought of Tom from the office, who said he didn't have time for church because his work mattered more. Each of them lived decently. Each of them would be shocked at the idea that their goodness could be a deception. I felt like a watchman called to the wall at night, asking people to look up from their good works and consider whose righteousness they trusted. I knew enough to see how different people would receive the message. Some would mock, some would consider,
Some would be angry at the implication that their life might be insufficient. But my mandate was not to force conviction. It was to warn and invite. Before I started telling everyone I knew, before I went live on a platform and tried to explain 9 minutes of being gone and then returned, I wrote. Words came out rough and urgent on the page. I wrote the story I had heard in the light. I wrote about the faces I had seen and the sadness that was in his eyes. I wrote, "The devil's greatest trap is not to make people evil. It is to make them complacent." I printed the letter and put it aside, because I needed to test how it landed in a smaller sphere first. The first person I gave it to was a friend from the old Sunday school class, David. He read it slowly, his hands folded over the paper.
When he looked up, his face had the blankness of someone who's been told a truth they didn't expect, but can't now unsee. He called a week later and said, "I've been thinking about what you said about goodness versus grace. I can't shake it." That call felt like an answered echo of the command to go and tell. Not everyone reacted like David. My boss, Mike, said, "Robert, sounds intense," and changed the subject to deadlines. Others offered kindness, but kept a distance from the spiritual urgency in my words. I learned quickly that telling people your life was hitched to an otherworldly warning is messy. It does not fit neatly into water cooler conversation. Still, the mandate pressed. The memory of that light and his words remained sharper than any scar. I felt the burden of those crowds, and the faces I had watched in the vision kept pacing in my head, an endless theater of the decent and the surprised. I wanted, needed to speak so that someone might turn in time. The days blurred into work and therapy and small talks that tried to skirt around the weight I carried. Friends brought casseroles. People texted, "So glad you're okay." Emma drew a picture of our family and taped it to my bedside table. Jake wrote me a note that said, "Dad, play ball with me soon." Those were the real things that held me, the small acts that mean a life continues. Yet the mandate was never fully satisfied by private repentance. I felt the tug toward public witness, toward telling not only those who were close, but those who would not otherwise hear. The vision of the crowds haunted me like an unfinished sentence. How many people lived in moral neighborhoods and never crossed the threshold of surrender? How many would nod at a checkbook donation and never bow at a knees-up moment? My conscience wouldn't let me rest. One evening, as I walked with Sarah through the grocery store, past aisles brightly lit and full of ordinary purchases, I tried to explain the urgency without making her feel accused. She stopped, put her hand in mine, and said, "If this is what you saw, we will walk it with you." Her faith had always been steady. She had been closer to the church than I was. Her willingness to stand by me was not a badge of my spiritual success. It was grace meeting grace. That night, I lay awake thinking of the people I needed to reach. I did not have a strategy beyond honesty. The words the pastor had given me, "Tell the truth plainly," were both terrifying and freeing. Plain truth is hard because it strips away the niceties that protect us from pain. But truth is also a kind of mercy. People deserve to hear what could be the difference between a life that continues into the fullness of what God offers and a life that, while respectable, is incomplete. I practiced sentences in the mirror. I wrote more letters. I started small, talking to men at the hardware store, then a small Bible study, then the group of parents who swapped carpools. Some conversations closed quickly.
Some opened like doors. Once, an older man named Henry, who had long been the kind of decent neighbor everyone admired, sat across from me with his coffee and said with a shudder, "You mean all this time I thought being careful and kind was enough?" "Yes," I said. "It's good, it's beautiful, it's necessary, but it is not enough to stand before God." He cried then, quietly, like a river finally finding an outlet. He told me he had treated others well because he refused to be selfish, not because he had ever asked God to be his Lord. He said he wanted that. He asked if we could read the gospel together. Not every response was Henry's. There were people who bristled, who defended their decency as if it were a shield. There were those who called me naive or said that perhaps what I saw was psychological, a brain's attempt to cope with trauma. I learned to hold both, the tenderness for those who needed time and the resolve to continue to tell the story anyway. But the inner work, the private repentance and the public warning, were not yet finished. I knew then there was more to be revealed, something about the crowds, the judgment, the exact nature of what people would say when confronted with the truth. The vision had given me a mandate, but it had also left me with images that demanded translation into language people could understand without being frightened away. That, I discovered, is harder than it sounds. The first weeks were a blur of hospital follow-ups. of reassurances from doctors, and awkward attempts to return to normalcy at work. I found myself flanked by two realities. One, the practical and mundane, forms to fill, paperwork, physical therapy, and the other, the urgent and eternal. They didn't coexist easily. People wanted the checklist. God was asking for a readiness that would change the checklist itself. It was in the juxtaposition of those realities that the devil's trap showed itself again. In office meetings, people praised my recovery, and I praised God. Yet in those same conversations, my tone softened when the subject of faith came up, as if I were ashamed of the urgency I carried. It made me see how easy it is to compartmentalize. Faith is something you store in the spiritual closet and take out on Sundays. The trap had not been wholly external. It lived in me, too. I had learned to perform goodness in public and postpone surrender for a later, more convenient time. One afternoon, a construction worker named Luis, who I had coached in youth baseball, stopped by the site where I was overseeing a small renovation. He handed me a sandwich and started talking about his child. He said, "We do what we can, right? We work hard. That's what matters." He looked at me, expecting affirmation. I felt a wave of compassion for him so strong it hurt. I told him the story, haltingly at first, and then with the directness the vision had taught me. He listened. He didn't call me a fanatic. He didn't join a Bible study the next week.
But when I saw him again at a ball game, he thanked me for being honest. There were moments of real transformation, even in the small circles. David's letter had been a beginning. Henry's willingness to read with me was another. But the vision had shown me rooms full of people, and the rooms seemed infinite. I felt the weight of the crowd, faces I knew and hundreds I didn't, and an awareness that what I was doing now would not be sufficient unless heart after heart started to turn. So I kept speaking. I kept writing. I kept meeting people in kitchens and church basements and at the hardware store. I tried to tell the truth plainly, about the light, about the voice, about the sorrow in his eyes when he looked at those who trusted only in their own kindness. I tried to say it without finger-pointing, because the last thing I wanted was for people to shut down out of shame. Shame makes people hide. Invitation opens doors. Yet there was still more to see. In the things he showed me, in the crowds and the arguments they offered before the one who judges the heart, I felt that there was a pattern I needed to name more precisely. It was not merely that people were moral, it was that they had unknowingly traded the centrality of Christ for the centrality of their conscience. That trade, I understood, creates a life that looks right, but is empty in the most important way. The problem is subtle, because it feels virtuous. When someone can point to a weekend of volunteer work and a reputation for honesty, they do not want to be told they are missing anything. Goodness has become a moral currency in our culture, the coin by which we say we've paid our dues. The devil's masterstroke is to get us to spend that currency and believe the bill is settled. I wanted to help people see that there is a difference between spending moral currency and being clothed in grace. The first leaves you with a ledger, the second with a life. And so I kept telling the story, even as I struggled to find words large enough for the images I'd been given in the light. Then, one night, as the house settled and the kids were tucked in, I opened the letter I had written and began to read it out loud to Sarah. The words sounded different spoken aloud. When I reached the part where I described the crowds, where people stood confident in their goodness and were baffled by the terms of the judge, Sarah stopped me. "Robert," she said softly, "are you afraid?" I was. Not of dying. After seeing what I had seen, death lost some of its sting, but of being the one who had to speak and be misunderstood. I feared that my urgency would be read as sensationalism, that the people I loved would bristle and close their doors. I feared becoming the man who lost his reputation because he won't stop banging on what looks like other people's front porches. But when I looked at her, I saw a steadiness that had always been there.
She said, "If what you saw is true, not telling them feels worse than being misunderstood." Her words were the hinge. I could live careful and respectable and be quietly wrong, or I could risk being misunderstood in order to save someone from a false security. I chose the latter. I don't know yet how far this will go. I don't know what doors will open and which will close. What I do know is the light, the voice, and the image of those crowds. I cannot live as if I did not see what I saw. A friend once told me that testimony is a dangerous thing because it invites people to judge you rather than wrestle with the message. I accepted that danger. What I didn't expect was how the danger would extend not just to my reputation, but to my relationships. Friends who liked the old me, who loved my stability, who didn't want the claim that their goodness could be a trap to alter the way they saw themselves. The night I was discharged from the hospital, Sarah and I stood at the threshold of our house, the porch light casting the usual warm glow. The kids had been woken earlier and given quiet one-on-one time. The world outside went on with its small, ordinary motions. Cars going by, someone cutting a lawn down the street. It was a picture-perfect evening, and yet nothing in that picture could hold the urgency I felt inside. I had been given a charge to warn, and warning people is messy and costly. It requires patience and compassion, plain speech and humility. Above all, it requires courage to hold out a hand and say, "This is what I saw. Consider where you're resting." When we walked inside, Sarah tucked the blanket around me and kissed my forehead. She whispered, "Tell them in love." I promised I would. That promise led me to a series of conversations and decisions that will change the course of what I do, and I hope what people hear. I would not be content to merely whisper this in the ears of a few. The vision had shown me crowds. Crowds require a microphone or a brave willingness to meet people where they are. How that would look in practice, the letters, the conversations, the times I would be mocked or called alarmist, I didn't yet know. But the mandate was clear. Go, warn, invite. So I began to write more widely. I wrote to friends and acquaintances. I wrote to people I barely knew. I wrote to David, and he wrote back. I wrote to Pastor Johnson to ask his counsel. And as words traveled from my hands into other hands, some responded with curiosity, some with dismissal, some with gratitude. Each response was a gospel of its own, a small revelation of whether the person was ready to consider a life rooted in Christ rather than rooted in their own righteousness. One evening, I got a letter from a man named Mark, a pastor in a neighboring town, who said bluntly that he had wrestled with the message I sent him. He wrote, "We have so many people who are moral pillars.
We have deacons who never miss committee meetings and yet never kneel in the dark and confess their need for Christ." He had been pastor for 30 years, and his words were not triumphant. They were anguished. He said, "We need people who will say what you are saying, Robert. Keep speaking." Those words buoyed me. Yet the pattern I'd seen in the light felt broader than what any of us could reach alone. The crowd image lingered like an unfinished painting. I kept thinking about the businessman who wrote checks, the mother whose prayers had become routine, the construction worker who took pride in his labor. How many of them would consider the posture of their heart? And so I prepared to speak to more people, to assemble my testimony into a form that could be shared beyond the porch and the coffee shop. But the exact words were still hard to find. How do you tell someone that their goodness, as beautiful as it is, may be a deception? How do you invite a person to surrender without them feeling accused? I learned that the only honest way was to begin with my own life, with my own failures of complacency. I had to tell the story without making a list of other people's faults. I had to be raw enough to say, "This could be me," and strong enough to say, "This was me." The combination of confession and urgency is the only bridge I could find between apology and warning. And so I started again, drafting, redrafting, and then calling people into conversation. The mandate hadn't changed. Go, tell what you have seen. Warn those who trust in their own goodness to wake up and consider what it means to be clothed in grace. I had a lifetime of good behind me. I was asking people to consider whether that good would carry them into eternity. The stakes felt enormous, and to be honest, I was terrified. The light would not let me rest. The face that held both sorrow and invitation remained with me. I promised I would obey. I promised I would go. And then there was a knock on the door, an ordinary thing in an ordinary life, but the knock that night would be the opening of the next chapter. There was a knock on the door, 3 short raps that sounded ordinary enough, like someone late for dinner. When I opened it, there was a man I hadn't expected, Tom from the office. He stood there, collar askew, eyes tired in that way stress makes your eyes tired. He held a copy of my letter, the edges soft where he'd read it more than once. "Can I come in?" he asked. The question was small, but the way he asked it carried the weight of weeks of thought. We sat at the kitchen table while the kids did their homework in the next room, and Tom fiddled with the coffee mug like a man avoiding the thing he most needed to say. He'd always been the sort who measured life by deliverables, meetings kept, projects finished, a reputation built on being the reliable guy. He had been the first to congratulate me after the surgery. Now he had come back with a different look.
"I read what you sent," he said.
slow as if testing each word. I figured I'd call you every kind of name you can think of. But I couldn't shake it. I keep hearing what you said. The devil's trick. That goodness isn't the same as his righteousness. He told me about how he had always assumed his life was tallied in a ledger somewhere, that being dependable and donating to the right funds would be his passport. He told me about arguments with his kids he never apologized for, holidays he had missed because work mattered, mercy he had offered without bending his heart toward the one who gives mercy. His voice broke when he said, "What if my goodness has been an answer, not the question?" We talked for hours. He didn't soften into a tearful conversion scene the way novels describe. It was messier. He made promises to pray and then admitted he didn't know how to start. He said he wanted to come to church and then confessed he was terrified people would expect something of him he didn't have. I told him what the pastor had told me. Start with honesty. He left with a copy of the Gospel of John and a request. Call me Monday. I want to try to read a chapter. That night, another knock came. This time it was Luis, the construction worker I'd coached in youth baseball. He smelled like sawdust and summer. There was a blister on his thumb. He'd always been practical. Faith in work, faith in family. He nodded when I started, as if the letter had confirmed something he'd half believed and half feared. "I'm not the prayer type," he said. But I got to thinking, what would it look like for me to actually ask? Not for the job or my kids' school, but just to be the kind of man who answers when God asks. I don't know what that looks like, but I want to try. We prayed together right there in my kitchen. Not a scripted prayer, but the raw thing two men can offer when they're finally honest. I didn't promise him anything but the offer of help, an invitation to come to the men's breakfast at church, to meet Pastor Johnson, to read the gospel he'd been given. When he left, he hugged me like a brother. Those small, ordinary knocks multiplied. Word had a way of moving in a small town. My letter found hands I'd not expected. Some people brought skepticism with them. An edge of mockery softened into curiosity. Others brought heartbreak. Henry, the older man who'd cried on my porch, came back with a list of names he wanted me to pray for. Mark, the pastor who had written encouraging words, suggested I speak at a community event. A nurse I'd seen in the vision, she emailed quietly and asked if we could meet. Her note said simply, "I've been doing good things my whole life. I never thought to ask who I was doing them for." Not every knock ended in reconciliation. Not every conversation led to tearing down walls. A few doors remained closed. My boss, Mike, maintained a polite distance, and a couple of friends stopped returning my calls. That hurt in a way I had not expected.
To be honest, sometimes it felt as if obedience exacted a social toll. But maybe that too is part of the witness. Choices produce consequences, not all of them comfortable. The pastor and I decided to hold a town meeting at the community center. We called it a time for testimony and conversation. The title was plain, Goodness and Grace, and we didn't dress it up beyond that. My hands shook the morning of the meeting. I had rehearsed in the mirror, rewritten the letter a dozen times, trying to find the words that would tell the truth without hammering people into shame. The room was a cross-section of that crowd I had seen in the light. Teachers in cardigans, a man in a suit who led a charity board, nurses in the back with their hands folded, a mother with flour on her sleeve, a group of construction workers who had stopped by after a shift. I could see the same pattern, faces of people like to point to as examples of decency. Some were attentive, some were guarded, some were openly skeptical. I didn't dramatize the experience. I told the story plainly, about the crash, the quiet, the light, the voice that called my name. I told them what I'd seen, decent people in a crowd, surprised at the terms of judgment, stunned at the realization that their goodness had answered questions they hadn't asked. I didn't wag fingers. I confessed the complacency in my own life, the times I'd settled for doing the good thing instead of surrendering to the good God. There was a hush in the room I'll not forget. After I finished, Pastor Johnson stood and said a few things about grace being a gift and works being the fruit that grows from a heart that has been changed. Then something happened I hadn't expected. The man in the suit, the one who chaired the charity board, stood up. He had the posture of someone used to commanding attention. "Robert," he said, looking at me without the ease of someone comfortable with vulnerability, "I used to think if you paid your dues and looked after your family, that was it. I supported every fundraiser within 50 miles. I thought that would be my legacy." When he paused, I could see his face shift. I don't know how to do the thing you're telling me to do, but I do know I have been running on a currency that I thought would buy me more than it can." Then he walked to the front, and he did something unexpected. He asked Pastor Johnson to pray with him right there. It wasn't a scene, no theatrical conversion. It was a man recognizing a desert that needed the river. He asked to learn, to read, to pray. People in the room wept quietly, others awkwardly clapped, some shifted in their chairs. It was not perfect. It was, however, real. After the meeting, people came forward in small clusters. The nurse I had mentioned earlier brought an envelope with a list of patients she felt had been forgotten.
A young teacher stayed behind and asked how to invite her students into something she could not name but had discovered that night. Louise signed up for a men's group. Tom asked for help understanding what it meant to trust Christ and not just live a decent life. Those were not earth-shattering headlines. They were the slow, patient work of change. There were also hard conversations. A woman in the back accused me of making people feel small for living a decent life. A man asked whether it was fair for God to set such terms after a lifetime of trying to do right. I answered as plainly as I could. I do not know how God weighs every deed. I do know what I had been shown, and what had broken me was not the idea that deeds don't matter, but that deeds can be used as a substitute for dependence on Christ. I tried to hold both the tenderness for those who had chosen decency and the urgency for those who might be resting in a false security. The days that followed felt like a second wake-up. People began to ask whether we could start a reading group through the Gospel of John. Several who had only nodded before began to ask for someone to walk with them through Scripture. Pastor Johnson offered to host sessions at the church for anyone who wanted to explore what it meant to be rooted in grace rather than in a ledger. It wasn't a mass wave of conversion. This isn't the kind of story that moves like a single title search, but ripples. One conversation at a time, a person at a time. Letters continued to arrive. David wrote again, full of questions and gratitude. Henry sent me a handwritten card saying he had finally knelt and told God he needed more than his own goodness. Mark, the pastor 2 towns over, invited me to speak at a clergy luncheon about how to shepherd people who were moral but spiritually unsettled. Those responses buoyed me in the moments I felt discouraged. Through it all, I learned something important about persuasion and posture. People don't respond well to a man who thunders about others' faults. They respond to honesty. They respond to a life that says, "I was wrong. Here is why. Here is the way I turned." That admission gives permission. It invites people to say, "Maybe me too." The role of a witness, I discovered, is less to convince than to testify, plainly, humbly, persistently. I also learned to expect resistance and remain gentle with it. Some mocked, some called me alarmist, some walked away. That is the cost of speaking plainly. I could not let the fear of being misunderstood keep me silent when I had been told to go. Months passed. The summer warmed into another autumn. Little things changed at home. I found myself more inclined to read with my kids, to pray at the table without thinking about how it looked, to be the man who asked for help rather than quietly counting my own virtues. Those changes were as much a part of the healing as the scar on my side. Sarah and I talked more honestly about faith. She continued to be my steady companion in the work of telling others. Every now and then the vision returns to me, not as a haunting, but as a reminder. The faces are clearer sometimes, the sadness in his eyes as vivid as the day I woke up. I remember the words he spoke to me in that light. "The door is open." That sentence is what I carry most. It is an invitation that doesn't shame for the effort you have made. It simply points to the root from which real life grows. If anything in this has unsettled you, I pray it unsettles you toward action, not despair. If you're watching and thinking, "That sounds like my life," then consider what it would look like to move from relying on goodness to resting in grace. You might start with something small. Read a chapter of the Gospel of John. Speak with a pastor or a friend who knows Christ. Kneel quietly and ask him to be the center of your life, instead of your own goodness. I can't tell you how God will answer your prayer or how he will move in your heart. I can only tell you what I was shown and what changed me. I know that turning, real turning, is not a performance of good deeds. It's a reorientation of the heart. If this story touched you, would you do one thing for me?
Share it with 3 people who need to hear a plain warning that goodness alone is not a substitute for surrender. Subscribe so we can share more honest stories like this, ones that refuse to hide behind respectability, and instead invite people into the life Christ offers. If you feel ready to take a next step right now, here are practical options. Read the Gospel of John. Start at chapter 1. Call a local pastor and ask if you can talk. Or if you want to pray, you can say something simple from the heart. Lord, I don't want to rely on my goodness. I want your life in me. Help me to turn. If you prayed that, or if you want someone to walk with you, reach out to a local church or to someone you trust. I don't have all the answers. I do have the light I saw, the words I heard, and the people who have already begun to turn. I have a family that walks this with me, and a community that has, in many ways, surprised me with its willingness to listen. And I have a mandate I cannot ignore. Go and tell those who may be sleeping under the blanket of their own goodness that the door is open. When the next knock comes at my door, I will answer. Whether it's a skeptic, a seeker, a neighbor, or a stranger, I'll sit down at the kitchen table and do the work of listening and telling. That's what the light left me for. That is the work I pray we will all take up, to warn, to invite, and to point people, not to the ledger of their lives, to the grace that alone can make those lives whole.